Good evening. Here we are again. What else could I say at the beginning of these videos? I mean, honestly, what am I now? 50, this is the 59th, I think. So nearly 60. 60 tomorrow, I think, is how many times I'll have done this. It is, you do sort of run out of ways to introduce something. It has to be said. I need to find new ways of introducing stuff. Or introducing myself, or introducing the video. Hello! We're here! Or, yeah, I don't know. Okay, answers on a postcard. Right, without too much further ado then, we're on chapter 9. Where is it? Oh, So Joe had come back into Lucy's world, got back into Lucy's world in the evening, and there's a party going on. There's bonfires and stuff. There's a party happening. And then he runs into Lucy's family in the street, discovers that they think that he had been press ganged and sent off to sea to go to war against the Dutch. And the English on this particular occasion have beaten the Dutch, and now there's this big party, and now he's home, and that's the sort of idea, which Joe sort of just about gathers enough in time. He goes back with them. They go to bed. He's sleeping in Peter's room. In fact, he's having to share Peter's bed, which is not something he enjoys. And then he's about to go to try and talk to Lucy because he hasn't had a moment to talk to her. And he realises Tobias is leaving the house. Tobias, who hasn't been out all day long throughout the whole party. Tobias hasn't been out, and now he's off out in the middle of the night. And so Joe thinks he's going to have to follow him. Okay, chapter 9. From the hall downstairs came the sound of the bolts being shot across as Tobias unlocked the front door. There was a screech from the monkey tethered in the back room and a muffled curse. Then Tobias went out, closing the door behind him. Joe crept down the stairs, still pulling his coat on. He would have to get back before Tobias if he was going to avoid being locked out. But that was a problem for later. "What are you doing?" hissed a voice. Joe jumped. At the top of the stairs behind him, he could see the pale shape of Lucy's nightdress. "Tobias has just gone out," he whispered back. "I think he might be up to something. I was going to follow him." "Wait for me. I want to come." "All right, but hurry or we'll lose him. I'll wait for you outside." Joe turned the door handle again. Again, there was a scream from the monkey. Joe winced, expecting Lucy's parents to come out to see what the noise was about. But nothing happened. He slid out onto the street and pulled the door almost closed behind him, leaving it open just a crack for Lucy. The number of people out here had dwindled since earlier, but the noise had not. The shouting was louder, the singing more raucous, and the party had a wilder edge to it. Joe looked up and down the road for Tobias. Had he delayed too long talking to Lucy? Then he saw a shadowy figure dart across the street down to the right, in the same way he'd gone out with Lucy. In the flickering light of the fires, he couldn't be sure it was Tobias. Yet the furtive way the person was moving seemed at odds with everyone else. This wasn't someone enjoying the celebrations. This was somebody doing something secret. Keeping under the cover of the buildings where they jettied out over the street, Joe hurried after him. Parts of the road were now completely dark, where households had shut themselves up to go to bed. But at the crossroads ahead, a large bonfire was still blazing. The smell of rotting bodies from the churchyards was as pungent as before, but the smell of smoke was stronger than anything else. At the crossroads, Joe paused. He thought Tobias had slipped down the street to the left, but he couldn't see him. He blinked and frowned. Surely he hadn't been that far behind. Then 2 people emerged from a doorway just a couple of houses down. Joe pressed himself against the wall and looked back towards Lucy's house. A small figure stood on the street. Joe waved. Lucy raised her hand and hurried towards him, lifting her cumbersome skirts. While he waited for her to catch him up, Joe turned back to watch Tobias, afraid of losing him again. But the other boy had relaxed his pace now, and walked with his companion as though they were out for an evening stroll together. "It's so busy and so bright tonight," Lucy said as she reached Joe. "My father doesn't like us being out after nightfall because of footpads. We sometimes are in the winter, of course, because the sun sets so early. But then the streets are dark and almost empty." "Maybe that was why Tobias chose tonight for whatever he's doing," Joe said. "With all the celebrations, it won't seem strange to anyone that he should be out." "What makes you so sure he's doing something that he shouldn't?" Joe looked at her. "What time is it?" "I don't know. Around midnight, I think, maybe later." "And is it normal to go out at that time?" "No, of course not, but this is hardly a normal night." "That's true," Joe admitted, "but your father seemed to think that Tobias had been at home while everyone else was out enjoying themselves. That's quite weird, don't you think?" "I suppose so." Ahead of them, Tobias and his companion hesitated for a few moments. Joe and Lucy waited in the shadows. "What do you think he's doing then?" Lucy asked in a low voice. "I don't know," Joe said, "but you remember I told you I'd met you before?" She nodded. "I didn't believe you, not about any of it, until I saw you vanish from under that cart. I was glad I could say you'd been pressed for the ships. I don't know how I could have explained it otherwise. But I was still in a lot of trouble, especially with my mother. I think she felt bad for letting us go out." "Oh, Lucy," Joe sighed. "I'm sorry. It's so unfair. That's happened before. I disappear and you get punished. Try and blame me next time. Or maybe," he brightened, "you might be able to blame Tobias. I told you, didn't I, that Tobias was there before, in all the other worlds? Well, every time he was scheming to get his hands on something that wasn't his, or trying to get ahead somehow." "Was he actually bad?" Lucy asked. "Or just unhappy or mistaken? I mean, we all want to get the best for ourselves, don't we?" Joe made a face. Perhaps he was unhappy, though he did smile and laugh sometimes when he was being cruel. He was always prepared to use you too, or hurt you, if it got him what he wanted. "Me?" Lucy looked alarmed. "Why me? I have almost nothing to do with him. I hardly even have cause to speak to him. It's obvious that he disapproves of our family, but why would he pick me out?" "I don't know. Maybe he won't this time." But Joe knew he didn't really believe it. "Hang on a minute. Where's he gone?" They scanned the street ahead. "We have to be careful," Lucy muttered. "If he and his friend went into one of these houses to collect somebody else, we could be right outside the door when they come out." "Wait." Joe touched her arm. "Is that them?" 3 shadows emerged from a house and turned left along a wider road. "Do you have any idea where they're going?" "That's Lombard Street," Lucy said. "It becomes Fenchurch Street." "What's along there?" "I've no idea." Silently they followed Tobias and his companions along the road, keeping at a careful distance. Suddenly the 3 figures disappeared between some buildings. "Where have they gone now?" Joe cried. "There's an alleyway there, I think," Lucy said softly. "I don't know where it comes out. Maybe behind the Pewterers' Hall." "The what?" "The Pewterers' Hall. The Pewterers are the craftsmen who make things out of pewter. You know, those grey metal cups and plates." "Why would they be going there?" "No idea. Maybe one of the others is apprenticed to them. It's more than likely they're all apprentices, if they're the same sort of age as Tobias. Or maybe they're just cutting through to somewhere else, though I don't know where." They waited a few more seconds to be sure they weren't too close behind the 3 boys, and then hurried to the mouth of the alleyway. It was pitch dark between the buildings, except for a faint light at the far end. "We should have brought a lantern," Lucy whispered. "I'm not so sure," Joe replied. "At least Tobias won't be able to see us." Together they began to feel their way. Lucy hitched up her skirts. Joe followed on tiptoe, acutely conscious of the white silk of the stockings he'd been lent. The alley was so narrow that two people would barely have been able to pass one another, and the ground was heaped with stinking muck and rubbish. Joe tried not to breathe in. He couldn't see where he was putting his feet, and it was horrible feeling his shoes sink into something soft or squelch through something wet. Lucy stopped abruptly. In the blackness, Joe fell into her. "What is it?" he breathed, getting his balance and trying to see over her shoulder. She shifted to one side so that he could stand beside her. "I think you were right," she murmured. "It looks like a secret meeting of some sort." Just a few metres in front of Lucy, 6 boys huddled together, talking in whispers, glancing over their shoulders now and then. One of them had put a lantern down in the centre of the circle. There was no other light here, no glow from the city's bonfires. The lamp shone upwards, turning the boys' faces into skulls. Their shadows loomed on the walls around them like an army of monsters coming out of the darkness. Joe looked upwards. One of the walls was very high, like the end wall of a church. That must be the Tudors hall. There were houses or workshops the rest of the way round the tiny yard, and a second alleyway on the far side of the group. But no street led to this spot, and there were no windows overlooking it. If you didn't know it was here, you'd be unlikely to stumble across it. That must be why Tobias had chosen it. Somehow Joe felt sure it was Tobias who had chosen the place. He was taller than all but one of his companions, so he might well be older than them. But in any case, Joe couldn't imagine him letting anyone else take the lead. Tobias was standing with his back to Joe and Lucy. Joe could just make out his voice among the rest, though the words were indistinct. Gradually, however, all 6 boys began to drop their guard and speak normally. Suddenly, Tobias's voice rose clearly above the others. "Why not tonight?" he pressed them. "If we all agree we should do it, why delay?" "It's too dangerous," objected one of the boys. "There are too many people about. One of us is bound to get caught." "Not necessarily," Tobias said. "And with all the fires burning already, nobody will ever know how it started. Don't you see, tonight would be perfect. God's punishment on the city for all this debauched behaviour. You've seen it, the drinking, the revelry, the godless pleasure." Joe shuddered at the hatred in Tobias's tone. "Even my own master squandered the day the Lord gave him, eating, drinking, and making merry with his family." Tobias raised his fist. His arm was shaking. "God shall smite them all." Joe heard Lucy draw breath sharply. He turned his head. Her face was taut with outrage. "That's us," she mouthed. He nodded. "I say we rain brimstone and fire upon the city," Tobias hectored. "As was rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah, brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven." Joe guessed he was quoting from the Bible. He sounded like a lunatic preacher. Tobias looked around the group. "And I say we do it now, tonight. William Malkin and John Dodgson to the Tower, John Archer and Thomas Foreman to the Palace of Westminster, and myself and William Freeman to the Palace of Whitehall." Lucy stiffened. "Oh my God," she breathed. "They're going to kill the king." "Are you sure?" Joe whispered. "He lives in the Palace of Whitehall." "What's at Westminster?" "The government." "And at the Tower?" "I'm not sure. It's a royal fortress, but I don't know who or what's inside." Joe tugged her sleeve to draw her further back into the alleyway. "Listen to me, Lucy," he said in a low voice. "You don't need to worry. It's the 14th of August today, isn't it?" She nodded. "Then it won't happen. There's nothing that happens until the Great Fire of London, and that's not till the 2nd of September. It's going to start at Farriner's Bakehouse in Pudding Lane in the early hours of the morning. That's where we need to be." She frowned. I don't see how you can be so certain. Of course I'm certain. History says that's what happens. But does history say what doesn't happen because somebody stopped it? She retorted. What about the plots that get discovered? The plans that are foiled? What if the only reason Tobias fails in this is that somebody finds him out? That somebody could be us, now, overhearing him. We have to do something. She moved along the alley to listen again. Joe felt his stomach sink. Could Lucy be right? What she was saying made sense. Maybe fate had brought them here to stop Tobias. Perhaps they couldn't just trust to history that he wouldn't carry out his plans. We shouldn't rush into anything, one of the boys was saying. I thought we were meeting to talk about possibilities. There was a murmur of assent from the others. Very well, Tobias said savagely. Since not one of you is brave enough to carry out the Lord's will tonight, we'll meet here again tomorrow. I shall bring the plans with me. The Lord has instructed me in every last detail of our task. You'll see how we shall set the fires that will cleanse this country of its wicked rulers and blow half of London into the sky as a punishment. Lucy gasped. Of course, that's what's at the tower. Gunpowder. In her fright, she spoke louder than she'd meant to. Tobias froze. What was that? He whirled round. There's someone listening. The other boys looked stricken. Thomas, John, search the alleyway over there, Tobias barked. You two, check those dark corners. Lucy didn't move. She seemed to be rooted to the spot. The fifth boy was coming straight towards her. Joe grabbed her. You mustn't get caught, he hissed. Go, quick, run back and find Tobias's plans and hide them. I'll delay him as much as I can. He pushed her back along the alley and heard her stumble and slip as she fought her way through to the street beyond. Before he could turn back towards Tobias, he felt a hand on his collar. He's here, called the boy. Joe kicked and struggled, not really to stop the boy hauling him out, but to cover the noise of Lucy escaping. Out of the way, you weakling! A second pair of hands grabbed Joe's shoulders. Tobias pushed the other boy aside. A moment later, Joe was slammed against the wall of the Pewterers' hall. His head spun. His hat was on the ground. Tobias's hand was at his throat, choking him. Joe looked into the familiar face of his enemy. Who are you? Snarled Tobias. With the lamp on the ground, his eyes were in shadow, but the twist of his mouth was as unpleasant as ever. How much did you hear? Joe spluttered. At least Tobias didn't recognise him from the meal he'd eaten with Lucy's family. That meant he wouldn't connect him to Lucy. Joe's gaze flicked past Tobias's shoulder. The 5 other boys had melted away. In fact, don't bother to answer, snapped Tobias. It makes no difference how much you say you've heard. I can't risk it. Either you come with us and help, or I'll have to kill you. Which is it going to be? So that's the end of the chapter. End of chapter 9. Which is it going to be? And will Joe be saved this time, or will he defeat Tobias? You'll have to come back tomorrow to find out. I had a feeling there was something else I was going to say to you, and it's completely escaped me. Dunno. Maybe it'll come back to me tomorrow. If it does, if it comes back to me, whatever it was I was going to say, if it comes back between now and tomorrow, I'll have to write it down. I'm getting a bit senile, because, I'm over 40. It's all downhill from there. Okay, have a nice evening. I will see you tomorrow.